Have you ever witnessed injustice and wished you had the courage to speak up? When a young black student confronted her racist teacher in front of the entire school, she never could have predicted the chain of events she would set in motion. What happened when the principal discovered the truth about his daughter's mistreatment? How did one student's bravery inspire a revolution that would change everything at Westfield High? Subscribe to our channel for the full incredible story and more inspiring tales of everyday heroes standing up to racism. Leave a comment letting us know where you're watching from and your thoughts on Imani's journey. The shrill ring of the bell pierced the air, signaling the start of another day at Westfield High. As students hurried through the hallways, a palpable sense of anticipation hung heavy in the air. Snippets of conversation echoed off the lockers, a cacophony of teenage chatter that filled the space between classes. Amidst the sea of faces, one student stood out, a newcomer to the school, her eyes wide with a mix of excitement and trepidation. Imani Johnson took a deep breath as she approached the door to her first class, her hand trembling slightly as she reached for the handle. As a young black woman, Imani was no stranger to navigating predominantly white spaces. She had learned from an early age that her every move would be scrutinized, her intelligence questioned, and her right to exist in certain environments challenged. Yet, armed with a fierce determination and an unwavering belief in herself, Imani stepped across the threshold, ready to embrace whatever lay ahead. As she entered the classroom, Imani was struck by the sudden hush that fell over the room. Dozens of eyes swiveled towards her, some filled with curiosity, others with a hint of skepticism. In the front of the room stood a tall, stern-faced woman, her lips pursed into a tight line as she appraised Imani with a critical gaze. This was Miss Sullivan, the notoriously strict English teacher whose reputation for being particularly harsh on students of color preceded her. "Ah, you must be our new student," Miss Sullivan said, her voice dripping with a false sweetness that did little to mask the underlying condescension. "Imani Johnson, is it? I do hope you can keep up with the rigorous demands of this class. We have high expectations here at Westfield." Imani met Miss Sullivan's gaze steadily, her chin lifted in a silent show of defiance. She had faced countless teachers like this before, those who assumed that the color of her skin was an indication of her intellectual capacity. But Imani refused to be cowed by the thinly veiled prejudice that simmered beneath the surface of Miss Sullivan's words. As she made her way to an empty desk at the back of the room, Imani could feel the weight of her classmates' stares boring into her back. She knew that as the only black student in the class, she would be held to an impossible standard, expected to be twice as good, while only ever being seen as half as worthy. But Imani was determined to prove them all wrong, to show that her brilliance could not be dimmed by the color of her skin. Little did Imani know that her presence in Miss Sullivan's classroom would spark a chain of events that would expose the deep-seated prejudices lurking beneath the surface of Westfield High. As she settled into her seat, ready to begin her first lesson, Imani had no idea that she was about to embark on a journey that would test her courage in ways she never could have imagined. In the coming weeks, Imani would find herself at the center of a battle against racial injustice, her every action scrutinized and her every word challenged. But with an unshakable resolve and the support of those who believed in her, Imani would rise to meet each obstacle head-on, determined to prove that one voice, no matter how small, could make a difference in the fight for equality. As the lesson began and Miss Sullivan's voice droned on in the background, Imani felt a flicker of anticipation sparking to life within her. Though the road ahead would be far from easy, she knew that she was exactly where she was meant to be, a trailblazer, ready to leave her mark on the world, one defiant act of courage at a time. As the days turned into weeks, Imani found herself increasingly at odds with Miss Sullivan's blatant bias. What had started as subtle microaggressions, a dismissive comment here, a pointed glare there, quickly escalated into a pattern of outright discrimination that left Imani feeling isolated and targeted. In class discussions, Miss Sullivan would consistently overlook Imani's raised hand, calling instead on her white classmates who often parroted back the teacher's own opinions. When Imani did manage to voice her thoughts, Miss Sullivan would cut her off mid-sentence, dismissing her insights as irrelevant or off-topic. It seemed that no matter how eloquently Imani expressed herself, her contributions were always met with a wall of resistance. The injustice of it all weighed heavily on Imani's shoulders. She watched as her classmates were praised for their half-formed ideas, while her own well-researched arguments were cast aside without a second thought. It was a painful reminder that, in Miss Sullivan's eyes, Imani's intelligence would always be overshadowed by the color of her skin. One particularly egregious incident occurred during a class debate on the themes of power and oppression in literature. Imani, who had spent hours preparing her talking points, waited patiently for her turn to speak. When Miss Sullivan finally called on her, Imani began to articulate her thoughts on the ways in which the assigned text reflected the systemic racism present in society. However, before she could even finish her first sentence, Miss Sullivan interrupted her with a sharp rebuke. "Imani, we've discussed this before. This is an English class, not a platform for you to push your own political agenda. Please stick to the text and leave your personal opinions at the door." Imani felt her cheeks burn with humiliation as a few of her classmates snickered behind their hands. It was a blatant double standard. When her white peers discussed their perspectives on race and identity, they were met with nods of encouragement and thoughtful follow-up questions. But when Imani attempted to do the same, she was silenced and dismissed. As the weeks wore on, Imani's frustration grew. She refused to let Miss Sullivan's prejudice dictate her academic experience, but she also knew that speaking out could come with serious consequences. She had heard stories of other black students who had been labeled as troublemakers or disruptive for daring to challenge their teacher's authority. Imani's classmates, too, seemed to be grappling with the tension that hung heavy in the air. Some, like her lab partner Emily, would shoot her sympathetic glances when Miss Sullivan's comments grew particularly cutting. Others, however, seemed to revel in the drama, their eyes gleaming with a sort of perverse excitement every time Imani was put in her place. One day, after a particularly brutal class session in which Ms. Sullivan had torn apart Imani's essay on the role of race in To Kill a Mockingbird, Imani found herself fighting back tears as she gathered her belongings. As she moved to leave the room, she felt a hand on her shoulder. It was Emily, her blue eyes wide with concern. "Imani, I just wanted to say that I think what Miss Sullivan is doing is really unfair. I've noticed how differently she treats you, and it's not right." Imani felt a surge of gratitude at Emily's words, but she also knew that allyship was more than just acknowledgement. "Thanks, Emily. I appreciate you saying that. But you know, it's not enough to just notice the problem. We have to actually do something about it." Emily's brow furrowed, and for a moment, Imani worried that she had overstepped. But then, slowly, Emily nodded. "You're right. I've been sitting back and watching all of this happen, but that's not okay. I want to help. What can I do?" Imani felt a flicker of hope at Emily's words. Maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone in this fight as she had thought. "Well, for starters, you can speak up when you see something happening in class. Don't let Miss Sullivan's comments go unchallenged. And maybe we can talk to some of our other classmates, see if they're willing to stand with us." Emily's face set with determination. "I'm in. Let's do this." As the two girls walked out of the classroom together, Imani felt a renewed sense of purpose. She knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, but with allies like Emily by her side, she felt a glimmer of hope that change was possible. Little did Imani know that her greatest challenge was yet to come. As she prepared for her upcoming class presentation, she could never have anticipated the firestorm of controversy that would ignite when she dared to speak her truth in front of her peers and her teacher. The stage was set for a showdown that would test Imani's courage like never before. The day of the class presentation arrived, and Imani could feel the tension crackling in the air like static electricity. For weeks, she had poured her heart and soul into researching and crafting her analysis of the themes of racial injustice in To Kill a Mockingbird. She knew that this was her chance to make a stand, to show Miss Sullivan and her classmates that her perspective mattered. As she walked to the front of the room, Imani could feel the weight of every eye upon her. Miss Sullivan sat at her desk, her arms crossed and her mouth set in a thin line. Imani's classmates shifted uneasily in their seats, some leaning forward with anticipation, others averting their gaze as if they couldn't bear to watch. Imani took a deep breath and began to speak, her voice steady and clear. She talked about the ways in which the novel's portrayal of racial injustice mirrored the reality of systemic racism in America. She cited examples from the text, drawing parallels between the fictional Maycomb and the very real disparities that existed in their own community. As she spoke, Imani could feel her confidence growing. She was no longer just a student, but a storyteller, weaving a tapestry of truth that demanded to be heard. Her classmates began to nod along, some even murmuring in agreement as she made particularly salient points. But then, just as Imani was hitting her stride, Miss Sullivan's hand shot up. "Excuse me, Imani," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "But I think you're missing the point entirely. This novel is about the loss of innocence, not some political agenda about race." Imani felt her stomach drop, but she refused to be cowed. "With all due respect, Miss Sullivan," she said, her voice even. "I believe that the loss of innocence in the novel is directly tied to the racial injustice that Scout and Jim witness. They lose their innocence precisely because they are confronted with the ugly reality of racism." Miss Sullivan's eyes flashed with anger, and she stood up from her desk. "Imani, I will not have you hijacking this discussion with your own biased interpretations. Stick to the facts, or sit down." A hush fell over the room, and for a moment, Imani felt the old familiar fear creeping up her spine. But then, she heard a voice from the back of the room. "But isn't that the whole point of literature? To interpret it through our own lenses and experiences?" Imani turned to see Emily standing up, her face flushed but her eyes determined. A murmur of agreement rippled through the class, and Imani felt a surge of gratitude. But Miss Sullivan was not to be deterred. "That's enough," she snapped. "I will not have my authority challenged in my own classroom. Imani, you may sit down. And as for the rest of you, remember that I am the one who will be grading your presentations." As Imani made her way back to her seat, she could feel the anger and humiliation burning in her cheeks. But beneath that, there was something else, a flicker of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, her words had made a difference. The rest of the presentations passed in a blur, with Miss Sullivan's critical eye growing sharper with each passing minute. By the time the bell rang, the tension in the room was so thick it was almost suffocating. As the students filed out of the classroom, Imani felt a hand on her arm. She turned to see Emily, her eyes shining with tears. "Imani, I'm so sorry," she whispered. "What Miss Sullivan did was awful. But I want you to know that I'm with you. And I'm not the only one." Imani glanced around the room and saw that several of her classmates were nodding in agreement, their faces set with determination. She felt a lump rise in her throat, and for a moment, she couldn't speak. But then, from the front of the room, Miss Sullivan's voice rang out. "Imani, I'd like to see you after class." Imani's heart sank, but she squared her shoulders and walked to the front of the room, Emily and her other classmates close behind. What happened next would change the course of Imani's life and the lives of everyone at Westfield High forever. As Imani faced off against Miss Sullivan, little did she know that the seeds of change had already been planted. The revolution had begun, and there was no turning back. As the classroom emptied, Imani stood before Miss Sullivan, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the eyes of her classmates on her back as they lingered by the door, unwilling to leave her alone with their teacher. Miss Sullivan's face was a mask of fury, her eyes narrowed to slits. "Imani," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "I don't know what you think you're doing, but I will not tolerate this kind of disrespect in my classroom." Imani took a deep breath, willing herself to stay calm. "Miss Sullivan," she said, her voice steady. "I wasn't trying to be disrespectful. I was simply expressing my interpretation of the novel, based on my own experiences and understanding." Miss Sullivan slammed her hand down on the desk, making Imani jump. "Your experiences?" she sneered. "What could you possibly know about the complexities of race and injustice? You're just a child, and a troublemaker at that." Imani felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "I may be young," she said, her voice shaking slightly, "but I have lived experiences that you could never understand. I know what it feels like to be judged and dismissed because of the color of my skin." Miss Sullivan's face twisted into an ugly scowl. "How dare you accuse me of racism?" she hissed. I have never treated you any differently than any other student." But before Imani could respond, a voice rang out from the doorway. "That's not true, and you know it." Imani turned to see Emily standing there, flanked by a group of their classmates. Their faces were set with determination, their eyes blazing with righteous anger. Miss Sullivan's face paled, and she took a step back. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded. "You all need to leave, right now." But Emily stood her ground. "We're not going anywhere," she said firmly. "Not until you acknowledge the way you've been treating Imani. We've all seen it, the way you ignore her in class, the way you dismiss her ideas. It's not right, and it needs to stop." A murmur of agreement rippled through the group, and Imani felt a surge of gratitude and pride. She had never expected her classmates to stand up for her like this, to put themselves on the line for what was right. Miss Sullivan's eyes darted around the room as if searching for an escape. But there was none to be found. She was trapped, caught in the web of her own prejudice and bias. And then, just when it seemed like the tension couldn't get any higher, a new voice spoke from the doorway. "What's going on here?" Imani turned to see a tall, distinguished-looking man standing there, his brow furrowed with concern. She recognized him instantly. It was Dr. Johnson, the school principal. Miss Sullivan's face drained of all color, and she stumbled backwards. "Dr. Johnson," she stammered. "I can explain." But Dr. Johnson held up a hand, silencing her. "I think I've heard enough," he said, his voice cold. "Miss Sullivan, I've been hearing some disturbing reports about your behavior towards certain students, particularly those of color. And now, I walk in to find a group of students bravely standing up to you, demanding justice and accountability." He turned to Imani, his eyes softening. "Imani," he said gently, "I'm so sorry that you've had to endure this kind of treatment. No student should ever feel marginalized or discriminated against in their own school." Imani felt a lump rise in her throat, and she nodded, unable to speak. Dr. Johnson turned back to Miss Sullivan, his face hardening. "As for you," he said, his voice like steel, "I think it's clear that your behavior is unacceptable. I will be launching a full investigation into your conduct, and if the allegations against you are found to be true, there will be serious consequences." Miss Sullivan's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, but no words came out. She seemed to shrink before their very eyes, all her power and authority draining away in the face of the truth. And then, Dr. Johnson turned to the group of students, his eyes shining with pride. "As for all of you," he said, his voice warm, "I want to commend you for your bravery and your commitment to justice. You are the future of this school and of this country. Never forget the power of your voices, and never stop fighting for what is right." As Dr. Johnson led Miss Sullivan out of the room, Imani felt a wave of emotion wash over her. She had never felt so seen, so validated, so supported. And as she looked around at the faces of her classmates, she knew that something had shifted. The revolution had begun, and there was no going back. In the days that followed, Westfield High was abuzz with the news of Miss Sullivan's downfall. Rumors flew through the hallways, each more shocking than the last. Some said that she had been fired on the spot, while others whispered that she had been escorted from the building by security, her belongings thrown into a cardboard box. But amidst all the gossip and speculation, one thing was clear: the students of Westfield High had had enough. They had seen the ugly truth of racism and discrimination, and they were determined to do something about it. Leading the charge was none other than Imani herself. Emboldened by the support of her classmates and the validation of Dr. Johnson, she found herself at the forefront of a movement for change. She organized rallies and sit-ins, spoke at school board meetings and community forums. Her voice, once silenced and dismissed, now rang out loud and clear, a clarion call for justice and equality. At first, the administration was resistant. They didn't want to admit that there was a problem, that the very foundation of their institution was built on a legacy of systemic racism. But as more and more students came forward with their own stories of discrimination and bias, they could no longer turn a blind eye. Dr. Johnson, to his credit, was a force for change. He met with Imani and her fellow activists regularly, listening to their concerns and working with them to develop a plan of action. He hired diversity consultants to train the faculty and staff, and he implemented new policies and procedures to ensure that every student, regardless of race or background, had an equal opportunity to succeed. But the road to progress was not an easy one. There were those who pushed back against the changes, who clung to the old ways of doing things. Some parents even threatened to pull their children out of the school, claiming that the new policies were reverse discrimination. Through it all, Imani remained steadfast. She knew that the fight for justice was never easy, that there would always be those who sought to maintain the status quo. But she also knew that she was not alone. She had the support of her classmates, her teachers, and her community. And most importantly, she had the strength of her own convictions. As the weeks turned into months, the culture at Westfield High began to shift. Students who had once been afraid to speak up now found their voices, emboldened by the example of Imani and her fellow activists. Teachers who had once turned a blind eye to instances of discrimination now stepped up to intervene, determined to create a more inclusive and equitable learning environment. And slowly but surely, the tide began to turn. The school board, once resistant to change, now embraced the new policies and procedures. They allocated funds for diversity training and multicultural programming, and they hired more teachers and staff of color to better reflect the diversity of the student body. For Imani, it was a bittersweet victory. She knew that there was still so much work to be done, that the fight for justice was far from over. But she also knew that she had made a difference. She had stood up for what was right, even when it was hard. And in doing so, she had inspired others to do the same. As she walked across the stage at graduation, her head held high and her heart full of pride, Imani knew that she was leaving Westfield High a better place than she had found it. She had fought the good fight, and she had won. And as she looked out at the sea of faces before her, her classmates, her teachers, her family, she knew that she was not alone. Together, they would continue to work towards a world where every person, regardless of race or background, had the opportunity to thrive. The road ahead would not be easy. There would be setbacks and challenges, moments of doubt and despair. But Imani knew that she had the strength and the courage to keep fighting, and with the support of her community behind her, she knew that anything was possible. As she stepped off the stage and into the bright light of the future, Imani felt a sense of hope and possibility wash over her. The revolution had begun, and there was no turning back. And she was ready to lead the charge. As the years passed, the impact of Imani's bravery and determination continued to ripple outwards, like a stone cast into a still pond. The changes she had fought for at Westfield High had set in motion a chain reaction that extended far beyond the walls of the school. Inspired by her example, students at other schools began to speak out against the injustices they saw in their own communities. They staged walkouts and sit-ins, organized petitions and social media campaigns. They demanded change, and they refused to be silenced. At the same time, Imani's story began to gain national attention. She was invited to speak at conferences and workshops across the country, sharing her experiences and her vision for a more just and equitable future. She became a role model for young people everywhere, a living embodiment of the power of one voice to spark a movement. But Imani knew that the fight was far from over. Even as she celebrated the progress that had been made, she was acutely aware of the challenges that still lay ahead. The ugly specter of racism and discrimination continued to rear its head in schools and workplaces, in courtrooms and on the streets. And so, she kept fighting. She went to college and earned a degree in social justice, honing her skills as an activist and an advocate. She worked with grassroots organizations and community groups, building coalitions and developing strategies for change. Through it all, she never lost sight of the lessons she had learned at Westfield High. She knew that change was possible, but that it required hard work, perseverance, and a willingness to speak truth to power. She knew that allyship was essential, that no one could do it alone. And she knew that education was the key to unlocking the potential of every young person, regardless of their background or circumstances. As she looked back on her journey, Imani felt a deep sense of pride and gratitude. She was proud of the work she had done and of the legacy she had left behind at Westfield High. And she was grateful for the support and encouragement she had received along the way, from her classmates and teachers, her family and friends, and from the countless individuals who had been inspired by her story. But she also knew that the work was not finished. There was still so much to be done, so many barriers to be broken down, so many minds to be changed. And she was ready to keep fighting, to keep pushing forward, to keep working towards a world where every person had the opportunity to thrive. As she stood before a crowd of young people, her voice ringing out with passion and conviction, Imani felt a sense of hope and possibility wash over her. She knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, that there would be setbacks and challenges along the way. But she also knew that she was not alone, that there were countless others who shared her vision and her determination. And so, she continued to speak out, to organize, to advocate. She continued to be a voice for the voiceless, a champion for the marginalized and the oppressed. She continued to fight for justice, for equality, for a better world for all. In the end, Imani's legacy was not just the changes she had fought for at Westfield High, or the accolades she had received for her work. It was the countless lives she had touched, the minds she had opened, the hearts she had changed. It was the ripple effect of her bravery and her determination, spreading outwards like a wave of hope and possibility. And as she looked to the future, Imani knew that the fight would go on. There would always be more work to be done, more battles to be fought, more minds to be changed. But she also knew that she was ready for whatever lay ahead. She had the strength, the courage, and the conviction to keep fighting, to keep pushing forward, to keep working towards a world where every person had the opportunity to thrive. The revolution had begun, and there was no turning back. And Imani would be there, leading the charge every step of the way.